What's up guys? Today we are going to tackle about the skeletal system. The word skeleton across from the Greek word meaning dried up body or mummy. A rather unflattering description, nonetheless it is a internal human framework of the body, consisting bones and other connective tissues that is almost perfectly adapted for the protective locomotion and manipulate functions it performs. As I have said, the skeleton is composed of bones, cartilage, joints, and ligaments, accounts for about 20% of the human body mass, weighing about 30 pounds in a 160-pound man. Bones make up the bulk of the skeleton. Cartilage only occurs in isolated areas such as the nose and the other parts of the ribs and the joints. Ligaments connects bones and reinforce joints, allowing required movements while restricting motions in other directions. Joints provide remarkable mobility of the skeleton without impairing its immense strength. For the function of the skeletal system, we have the following. It is the structure of the human body. Movement, protection of the internal organs and body tissues, and also for the nutrient storage. For descriptive purposes, the 206 bones of the human skeleton are divided into two parts. So we have the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So now we have for the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton is structured from 80 bones, segregated into three major regions. We have the skull, the vertebral column, and the bony thorax. Besides forming the upright axis of the body trunk, the axial skeleton helps protect the brain and spinal cord and the organs housed within the thorax. So first we have the skull. Skull is the body's most bony structure. It is formed by two sets of bones, the cranial bones and the facial bones, which is 22 in number in all. The tiny bones of the middle ear cavity are sometimes counted as skull bones too, but since they are involved in hearing, they are considered as special senses. Now we are going to locate each bone of the skull. First we have the cranial bones. So for the cranial bones, we have 8 cranial bones. We have the 2 parietal bones, the 2 temporal. So we have the frontal, occipital, sphenoid, and ethmoid bone. They are responsible to enclose and protect the fragile brain and the organs of hearing and equilibrium. Frontal bone forms the anterior portion of the cranium, the forehead, roofs, or the orbits, and the anterior cranial floor. Parietal bones. The 2 parietal bones form most of the top and superolateral aspects of the skull. The 4 major sutures of the skull occur where the parietal bones articulate with other cranial bones. Occipital bone. It forms most of the posterior wall and base of the skull. Externally, it articulates anteriorly with the paired parietal and temporal bones via the lam, lambdoidal and occipitomastoid sutures, respectively. Internally, it forms the wall of the posterior cranial fossa. In the base of occipital bones is the foramen magnum, literally a large hole, the passageway between the vertebral and cranial cavities. Temporal bones. The two temporal bones lie inferior to the parietal bones and meet them at the squamous sutures. It forms the inferolateral aspects of the skull and parts of the cranial floor. Sphenoid bone. The butterfly-shaped sphenoid bone spans the width of the cranial floor. The sphenoid is considered as the keystone of the cranium because it articulates as the central wedge with all other cranial bones. It consists of a central body and three pair of processes: the greater wings, the lesser wings, and the paired pterygoid processes. Ethmoid bone. Like the temporal and sphenoid bones, the ethmoid bones has a very complex shape. Situated between the sphenoid and the nasal bones of the face, it is the most deeply hidden bone of the skull and forms most of the bony area between the nasal cavity and the orbit. So most skull bones are flat bones except for the mandible. So all bones of the adult skull are firmly connected by the immobile interlocking joints, as I've mentioned earlier, the sutures. These sutures have a tortuous or serrated appearance, particularly or obviously on the external bone surfaces. The major skull sutures, we have the coronal, sagittal, squamous, and the lambdoid that connects the cranial bones. Coronal suture is where the parietal bones meet the frontal bone anteriorly. Sagittal suture. It is where the two parietal bones meet at the cranial midline. Lambdoidal suture. It is where the parietal bones meet the occipital bone posteriorly. Squamous suture. It is where a parietal and the temporal bone meet on the lateral aspect of the skull. So we will move on next to the facial skeleton. The facial skeleton is made up of 14 bones, of which only the mandible and the vomer are unpaired while the rest are paired bones. As a rule, the facial skeleton of men is more elongated than that of a woman. Therefore, woman's face led to be rounder and somewhat less angular. Mandible. The U-shaped mandible or lower jaw is the largest and the strongest bone of the face. Maxillary bones. The maxillary bones or the maxilla are fused medially. They form the upper jaw and the central portion of the facial skeleton. Zygomatic bones. The irregularly shaped zygomatic or major bones are commonly called the cheekbones. Nasal bones. The thin, basically rectangular nasal bones are fused medially, forming the bridge of the nose. Lacrimal bones. The delicate fingernail-shaped lacrimal bones are major contributors to the medial walls of each orbit. Palatine bones. The horizontal shape of the L-shaped palatine bones complete the posterior portion of the hard palate. Each of the palatine bone is elliptical plate that forms part of the posterolateral wall of the nasal cavity and a very small part of the orbit wall. Vomer. The slender plow-shaped vomer is located within the nasal cavity where it forms part of the nasal septum. Inferior nasal conchae. It is a thin curved bone seen projecting from the lateral walls of the nasal cavity just below the middle concave of the ethmoid bone. So there are also special parts of the skull. This one includes the orbit, nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, and the hyoid bone, which is not connected to any bone in our part of our body. The orbits are bony cavities within which the eyes are firmly encased and cushioned by fatty tissue. The nasal cavity is constructed of bone and hyaline cartilage. Most of its bony structure is formed by the ethmoid bone. Paranasal sinuses. It lightens the skull and enhances the resonance of the voice. The five skull bones, frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and paired maxillary bones contain mucosa-lined or an air-filled sinuses. The hyoid bone. Though not really part of the skull, the hyoid bone is intimately related to the mandible and temporal bones. It does not articulate directly with any other bone. It serves as a movable base for the tongue and an attachment point for neck muscles that raise and lower the larynx during swallowing and speech. So next we have the vertebral column. The vertebral column is also called the spine. It is formed from 26 irregular bones connected in such a way that a flexible, curved structure results, serving as the axial support of the body trunk. The spine extends from the skull, which it supports, to its anchoring point in the pelvis, where it transmits the weight of the trunk of the lower limbs. Additionally, the vertebral column provides attachment points for the ribs and for the muscles of the back. And the vertebral column cannot possibly stand upright by itself, so it is held in place by the ligaments and the cushion-like pad intervertebral disc. So the vertebral column has 5 major divisions. The 7 vertebrae of the neck and the cervical vertebrae, and the next 12 are the thoracic vertebrae, and the 5 supporting the lower are the lumbar vertebrae. Inferior to it is the sacrum, which articulates with the pelvis, and the terminus of the vertebral column is the coccyx. Let's move on to the bony thorax. Anatomically, the thorax is the chest part, and its bony underpinnings are called the bony thorax or the thoracic cage. The elements forming the bony thorax include the thoracic vertebrae, dorsally the ribs laterally, and the sternum and the costal cartilages. Anteriorly, the bony thorax forms a protective cage around the vital organs of the thoracic cavity. It supports the shoulder girdles and the upper limbs and provides attachment points for the muscles of the back, chest, and shoulders. The sternum. The sternum or breastbone is located in the anterior midline of the thorax. It consists of three regions. First is the manubrium. The superior portion is shaped like the knot in a necktie. Next is the body or mid portion, forms the bulk of the sternum, and lastly is the xiphoid process, which forms the inferior end of the sternum. Ribs. We have 12 pairs of ribs forming the flaring sides of the thoracic cage. The upper 7 rib pairs attach directly to the sternum by individual costal cartilages. The true or vertebrosternal ribs. The remaining 5 pairs of ribs are called false ribs. The 8 to 10 pairs of ribs attached to the sternum indirectly by joining to each other via the costal cartilages immediately above are also called vertebrochondral ribs, while the rib pairs 11 and 12 are called vertebral ribs or floating ribs because they have no anterior attachments. Their costal cartilages lie embedded in the muscles of the lateral body wall. So now we have the appendicular skeleton. The bones of the appendicular skeleton hang suspended from the yoke-like bony girdles anchored to the axial skeleton. Thus, the bones of the appendicular skeleton are upended to the longitudinal axis of the body. It includes the upper limb and the lower limb, whereas the axial skeleton provides the central support for the body and protects internal organs. The bones of the appendicular skeleton are adapted to carry out the movements typical of our freewheeling and manipulate lifestyle. So we have the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle or shoulder girdle consists of two bones, the anterior clavicle and the posterior scapula. The two pectoral girdle and their associated muscles form your or our shoulders. Scapula or shoulder blades are flattened triangular bones located on the dorsal thorax between ribs 2 and 7. It articulates with the clavicle and with the humerus bones of the arms. Also, we have the upper limb. There are 30 separate bones forming the skeleton framework of each upper limb. Each of these bones may be described regionally as a bone of the arm, forearm, and hand. Arm or humerus. The sole bone of the arm. It is a typical long bone, the longest bone of the upper limb. It articulates with the scapula at the shoulder and with the radius and ulna at the elbow. Forearm. Two parallel long bones, the radius and the ulna, form the skeleton of the forearm or antebrachium. Their proximal ends articulate with the humerus, and their distal ends form joints with bones of the wrist. In anatomical position, the radius lies laterally on the thumb side and the ulna medially. Radius. It is a triangular in cross-section and marked by lengthwise ridges. Ulna, slightly longer than the radius and has the major responsibility for forming the elbow joint with the humerus. Hand. The skeleton of the hand includes the bones of the carpus or wrist, the bones of the metacarpus or palm, and the phalanges or bone of the fingers. Pelvic or the hip girdle. The pelvic girdle is a heavy structure specialized for weight bearing. It is composed of two costal bones that secure the lower limb to the axial skeleton. Together with the sacrum, the costal bones form the basin-like bony pelvis. It also consists of the three fused bones. We have the ilium, ischium, and the pubis. Ilium is a large flanking bone that forms the major portion of a costal bone. Pubis or the pubic bone forms the anterior portion of the oscosa in its anatomical position. It lies nearly horizontally and the bladder rests upon it. Ischium forms the posterior inferior part of the hip bone. So we have for the lower limb. For the lower limb, we have the lower limbs carry the entire weight of the erect body and are subjected to exceptional forces when we jump or run. Thus, it is not surprising that the bones of the lower limb are much more thicker and stronger than the comparable bones of the upper limbs. Each lower limb consists of the thigh, leg, and we have the foot. Thigh or the femur, the single bone of the thigh. It is the largest, longest, strongest bone in the body. It has a patella or kneecap. The patella is a triangular sesamoid bone endorsed in the tendon that secures the anterior thigh muscles to the tibia. Leg. Two parallel bones, the tibia and fibula, form the skeleton of the leg, the region of the lower limb between the knee and the ankle. The bones of the leg are thus less flexible but stronger and more stable than those of the forearm. Tibia or the shin bone receives weight of the body from the femur and transmits it to the foot, except for the femur. It is the largest, strongest bone in the body. Fibula. The non-weight-bearing fibula is a stick-like bone with slightly expanded ends. It articulates proximally and distally with the lateral aspects of the tibia. Foot. The skeleton of the foot includes the bones of the tarsus, the bones of metatarsus, and the phalanges or toe bones. Metatarsus. The metatarsus consists of 5 small long bones called the metatarsal bones that form the sole of the foot. These are number 1 to 5, beginning with the medial or the great toe side of the foot. The arrangement of metatarsals is more parallel than that of the metacarpals of the hands. Phalanges or toes. The 14 phalanges of the toes are a good deal smaller than those of the fingers, and thus much less nimble, but their generally structure and arrangements are the same. There are 3 phalanges in each digit except for the great toe, the hallux, which has only 2, the proximal and distal phalanx.